Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Phil Anderson of Fitchburg is a Republican candidate in the 47th Assembly District. Phil, welcome back to WisconsinEye.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Well, I had to check. It says Republican here. I've interviewed you a few times as a libertarian. You want to talk about your political evolution?
Well, I haven't really evolved, I would say. Myself and a couple of other libertarians were approached in January to run as Republicans in Dane County, mainly because GOP leadership realized that your sort of garden variety Republicans, hadn't been doing well in Dane County, and some of the things that we as libertarians believe in and support would. So the trade-off, more or less, is that they are supporting us. We have had support from the Dane County Republican Party as well as the state party, their infrastructure, access to their donors, et cetera. And we're running with ours behind our names, but we're running libertarian campaigns. We're not changing any issues, any positions. We're running honest campaigns, much as we have in previous cycles.
Well, policies and principles are important to you. Say it. Tell me again, you haven't changed any of your ideals?
Not a single one. Nope.
Okay.
That was the deal. That was the deal I made.
All right.
I would not do that. And I'm proud to say that I've not buckled on that.
Okay. Issue number one in this campaign.
I think it's leadership. What we've seen from, and actually both sides of the aisle in Madison, in the Capitol building, is a lack of leadership on issues. They present solutions to things and then don't budge, don't negotiate. And that's what really got me interested in this opportunity in the first place. But in particular, Governor Evers and my opponent, Representative Jimmy Anderson, don't be confused, folks. Jimmy is not the same as Phil, have really shown little leadership in the face of this latest rash of violence, the expressions of serious protest, and haven't really stepped up and offered solutions in a way that can bring both sides of the conversation together. If you follow a lot of what comes out of the governor's office and my opponent's office, it's generally, lobbing grenades over at the Republicans, a few solutions offered, but not very palatable ones, and a lack of conversation. And it inspired me as somebody who's run as third party and who's really wanted to be involved in the discussion to solving these problems. As you know, Steve, I've run very hard on criminal justice reform in previous campaigns, police reform, as well as other things. I'm not afraid to tackle those issues, nor am I afraid to say that somebody across the aisle from me has a solution that should be examined. And I think that's what we need in politics right now.
Okay, let's stay on that. The governor's 9-bill package on policing reforms. But you support any of it? Does it not go far enough? What?
I support most of it, to be honest with you. I think that there's been a lot of political positioning there, and I would call out Representative Voss and others for not examining that. I don't know the intricacies of the political maneuverings in terms of parties within the Capitol and what may be a good idea or not, depending on how polling goes. But a lot of those things are things that I proposed when running in 2016 and 2018. Getting rid of qualified immunity. First and foremost, legalizing cannabis. That's not exactly a popular position among Republicans, but it's a primary concern for criminal justice reform and police reform as well. It's important that we get rid of qualified immunity, as well as looking at the ways that police are accountable or not accountable. But at the same time, and this is what the governor's not done, nor my opponent, has really shown support for the peace and the law and order that's necessary to have these conversations. They've supported, to a certain extent, and let happen a lot of the violence that drives the division between the two sides of this debate. And it's a shame because it doesn't need to be that way. People who are willing to lead, get out in front of these things, address both sides, try to calm things down and propose solutions. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that from Governor Evers nor Representative Anderson.
Well, you seem to be criticizing both sides. Protesters that turn into violent and armed militia people that show up saying they want to protect property. Are you condemning both their houses?
Absolutely. That in a nutshell is indicative of a lack of leadership from both sides. If you get out in front and disclaim as some Democrat folks have done and some Republican folks have done with the militia folks, if you get out in front of that and disclaim it and separate the legitimate protest versus the violence and rioting and the legitimate concerns for law and order and defense of private property from the militia folks. I mean, look at what happened in Kenosha. They arrested a ton of people throughout those protests, and a lot of them were from out of state. How does that happen? And I think the same is the case in Madison, too. It was reported, I think, about 10 days or so ago, there was a protest, an organized protest in downtown Madison, where there was a march led down to the square, and all the mainstream media was there covering it. It dissipated at about 8:30, and then about an hour later, a whole new set of protesters came downtown and were setting fires in dumpsters and blocking streets, and the police had to go out in riot gear and deal with them. It's clear that there's a lack of leadership there, and that the fact that the sides that want the same thing, justice with peace, peace and justice, aren't talking about this and are politically posturing is a huge problem for everybody, regardless of political affiliation. And that's what I aim to work on when I'm elected.
Okay, new subject. As a libertarian turned Republican, who should draw the next set of congressional and legislative district maps? The People's Maps Commission, which Evers wants, or do we have to follow the Constitution, which has a party in power?
I think it should be nonpartisan. And I don't have a comment right now on what the governor cooked up, because it's not, from what I understand, it's sort of half Democrat, half Republican, with maybe somebody who has a tie-breaking thing. And I think it should be even more nonpartisan than that. If we can maybe put together a committee like that then hires an outside firm to do it based on the criteria, I think that's the best way to do it, and it's been successful in other states. But I'd also like to point out one thing in terms of gerrymandering. A lot of the things in my district in particular, you look at it, all the jagged edges of it, and you assume that it's gerrymandering, when in fact it's just following municipal boundaries between the town of Madison, the city of Fitchburg, the city of Madison, and those look gerrymandered and they're not. So I think there's really an opportunity for a larger scale reform of redistricting in a way that makes more common sense and doesn't necessarily rely on those jagged municipal boundaries, because people don't live their lives according to those municipal boundaries. There are communities and neighborhoods that are more cohesive than that we can take into account.
Okay, a few questions on the pandemic. Some state Senate Republicans want to repeal the governor's statewide mask edict in enclosed places. Where are you on the mask edict?
Well, I think it was a grievous overreach on behalf of the governor's office, and he's not afraid to do that. I do support wearing masks. I go out in public wearing a mask. I think a mask is effective. I'm not a hoaxer or somebody that denies that COVID is serious. There's a lot of evolving science about it. I'll say that. But I think it's the hard work of government to look at the whole state and to look at certain parts of the state that may not need a mask, a mandate, and that the county authorities and local authorities are doing a really good job of their business, and not necessarily statewide. And I think that's the easy way out, and I think it's the political way out if you're pandering towards a certain group of people who've been made afraid of COVID, maybe even more than they should be.
We got a report Monday that said that state tax collections held up. They were up 1% in the year that ended June 30. Everybody's worried about tax collections in the current year because of the pandemic. If we're $1.5 billion or $1 billion short in the current year, cut spending, raise taxes or fees?
Cut spending, definitely. And I mean, as somebody with a libertarian background, I'm not excited about revenues being down, but I don't really mind it, because that's something I would be rooting for anyway. But going back to criminal justice reform, one of the big benefits of the plan that I put forward is that it will relieve pressure and population in the jails. It will eventually, as families become, reunited, where there's families that have both father and mother in the home, that kids will be better supervised, that will relieve pressure and expense of social workers in schools. It will get more tax revenue because more people will be working as opposed to being incarcerated. All of these things are huge benefits to following my criminal justice reform plan. And I don't think that's one that's been taken up seriously by this governor, maybe because the Republican-dominated legislature has control over that. But I think the people, especially with cannabis reform, but with all the other things, regardless of political affiliation, are ready for those changes to be made. And for what I put forward, there are huge benefits to both sides, the social justice side, the racial injustice side, the cost side, the family, supporting the family side. All of those things are benefits that are realized by what I put out there and have been putting out there for 6 years.
And part of your plan, as you said, is legalizing both medical and recreational marijuana, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Let's talk about another pandemic issue. We've seen how hospitals have been on the front lines of caring for COVID-19 patients. You're elected, you're voting on the next state budget. Do hospitals deserve a greater priority than they might have in the current budget, Phil?
I would agree that they, while not saying that to increase spending necessarily, that a priority for helping them with dealing with COVID is important. My vision of a state budget is one that's smaller and growing smaller, where we're turning over functions, government is becoming more efficient, and we're turning over functions to lower levels of government, county and local. So I'm definitely not saying to increase funding with hospitals. However, that's a very important thing. And once we have a vaccine, which it sounds like, at least it's possible we'll have one available on November 1st, that I definitely believe that we need to get that to people who are first responders and caregivers right away, because they're the most exposed. And they're the ones whose efforts are multiplied throughout the community by the fact that they're then available to help the rest of us who might come down with it. So they're a priority, yes. But in terms of blanket increase in spending, I don't think that ever really works in terms of the results that people think they're going to get.
State Senator Chris Capping this week sponsored a bill that says this: if you're a business or an organization that you have followed the COVID-19 CDC guidelines, you should be exempt from COVID-related lawsuits. So you've tried to protect your employers or customers, you shouldn't be able to be sued. Do we need that state law?
Well, I don't know if we need the state law. It kind of depends on what the case law is behind that sort of thing. And I'm sure there's history, legal history that I'm not a scholar of. However, if people are following, businesses, organizations are following the guidance given by the CDC, given by the governor's office, then they should be not only exempt from lawsuit, because they've followed everything that they were in full knowledge of following. I mean, you can't expect businesses and organizations to know more than the scientific community and be proactive in that way. But I also think they should be exempt from the governor's mandate. In counties and places where people are doing the right thing, then they shouldn't have to abide by a one-size-fits-all mask mandate. And actually, that's what's happening in Dane County right now with the schools. One of the issues I've been active with in the last couple of weeks is the Dane County Health Department's order not allowing private schools to meet in person for grades 3 through 12. And their data is completely skewed, and they're not following guidelines that they claim they are, and they're not following guidelines from other states as they claim they are. So we need to be free to call them out on that science, their supposed science, their quoting of science, and they're also not being responsive to us in terms of trying to engage them in conversation about that. So I'm totally against, and I've always been against, sort of the government putting its big hand on people and one size fits all. It's the hard work of being good government to take different situations and to be able to explain to your constituents and your backers that I did this in this situation because, not because it was politically expedient or because it made great headlines or because it raised me money, but because it was the right thing to do for that situation.
Property taxes high in Wisconsin. For that reason, schools and local governments have been living for more than 2 decades with limits and caps on what they can levy in property taxes. You're a legislator voting on the next state budget. Keep those caps and limits in place?
Well, I'm a little conflicted on that, to be honest with you. I don't like the state government mandating local tax levies and that sort of thing. I think the ideal situation would be that local units of government, counties, can decide what their property tax will be, and then people will vote for their feet. In the same way that people vote right now about the condition of certain school systems, where they'll prefer to be in one school system over another. And as a real estate broker, I'm fully aware that property values change and the market value changes based on what school district it is. That should also change, and would change, obviously, if property taxes are grossly different from one state or one county to another, and the caps are taken off. So I would prefer that the caps are removed, but not being an expert on how all that plays out, I'd be open-minded to listening to a case for having a cap on them. But ideologically, I'm against the caps.
To reduce the reliance on property taxes by local governments. Time to give them new revenue options. Consider giving them new revenue options. Milwaukee County, for example, wants to levy its own half-cent sales tax.
Well, I'm in favor of that, again, in principle, because people can vote with their feet. And when the government gets irresponsible with local tax levies, then you see situations like in Chicago, for example, where people travel out of municipal Chicago to avoid local sales taxes. The same thing will happen here. With a 0.5% sort of thing, it maybe doesn't drive people out of the county, but if local governments, counties governments are allowed to jack up taxes and thinking that people will just suck it up, well, remember that the reason that Epic is in the location it's in had somewhat to do with the tax burden in Madison. And another cautionary tale is that we still have a 0.5% sales tax in place in Dane County for a jail that was expanded in the 1990s. And now they're telling us they need to raise the levy more. He has the same issue with the baseball stadium that they're paying for that still. Once a tax or a policy is instituted, it rarely goes away. So just be careful what I'd be careful what citizens vote for in terms of local levies, because it's really hard to get taxes reduced once they're in place.
Governor Evers last year, as you know, recommended raising the gas tax to stabilize the way we pay for highways and bridges. It's 30.9 cents per gallon, hasn't been raised in 10 or 12 years. Could you vote to raise the gas tax?
I would only vote to raise the gas tax if other taxes were lowered that are currently going to paying for roads. I prefer an approach where the people that are using the roads are paying for them. And that goes for private citizens, businesses, whoever. And as we know, a lot of that cost, if it's paid for via gas tax or tolling, which I'm open to, would get passed along to consumers in the price of goods. That's the most fair way to do it. Part of the problem is that we've got a DOT that hasn't exactly been efficiently run for a long time. If you remember 2 years ago, one of the issues that I brought up in the campaign was that it was uncovered that the DOT was paying bills twice for a lot of road construction in Milwaukee, Racine, and Kenosha counties, but it was uncovered that there was a lot of double paying going on, a lot of inefficiencies. People like myself wondered if it was political payback or if it was just negligence or incompetence. I don't know. But until we have a thorough audit of the DOT, how it spends money and why it spends money, I don't think we can adequately address how we're going to pay for roads. But I would be in favor of more usage-based as opposed to just blanket coming from other sources.
New subject. If a school district or a local government wants a major public works project, should they have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses? A study found in 2015, out-of-state contractors on public works projects got contracts that totaled $72 million. That doubled within 3 years to $146 million. Local governments have to give a preference to Wisconsin businesses?
I don't think so. I think that's a trap. People have one of the things that's been a problem in American politics now for a long time is people disconnect government spending with the taxes that it's how it's being collected. So if we're paying Wisconsin businesses more, then we're spending more taxpayer money. And not only that, but it adds to the possibility, and I'm not making any allegations, but it adds to the possibility that there's some political maneuvering going in the background where local companies that have more access to local politicians are getting more contracts. I think we've seen that at least suspicious looking activity with road building in particular, but in others as well. I'd be very suspicious of narrowing it down to that. What we should be doing on behalf of the taxpayer money that we've collected is spending it wisely and carefully and efficiently and getting the job done the best, regardless of where that comes from.
Final question, differences between you, the incumbent you're trying to knock off on November 3rd?
Well, I think I highlighted it at the beginning. There's been pretty much a lack of leadership, and Jimmy and I agree on a few things, disagree on a lot more, but I would feel as if he was doing a good job given the fact that he was elected in a Democrat-dominated district. If he seemed like he was trying to have some, exert some leadership, and if he were understanding that probably 30% or so of his district are people that identify as Republicans, but the constant stream that comes out of his Twitter, his press releases is all about just lobbing bombs at the Republicans, blaming everything on the Republicans, talking about President Trump, who I'm not a huge fan of, but I think that's just kicking the can down the road. He hasn't run against a serious candidate. He hasn't run against a Republican since he was elected in 2016. He had an independent opponent, I think, in 2016, who got about 30% of the vote, who was running as a socialist. But I think it's time for him to answer for his lack of leadership and for him to be either forced by the will of his constituents to address issues and take leadership, or let somebody in or lose an election, to me, where I can come in and see both sides of an issue, exert some leadership, and really fight for the whole district and not for the people that just voted for me or contributed to me.
Thank you. Phil Anderson of Fitchburg is a Republican candidate in the 47th Assembly District. The election is November 3rd. Phil, thanks for talking to Wisconsin Eye.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Steve.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.